Good morning, everyone. There's a line we've all heard, maybe in a book, a conversation, or a quiet moment of reflection. At first glance, it might sound passive, as though silence means inaction or retreat. But let me be very clear, silence isn't the absence of power. It's often where our power is born. As a researcher and someone deeply fascinated by human behavior, I've seen how much we equate silence with emptiness. But silence is not a void. It's a space, one that allows us to hear what we've been ignoring. In silence, the stories we've buried, the truths we've delayed, and the wisdom we've overlooked start to rise. In psychology, we call this cognitive integration. The quiet helps the brain connect the dots that stress and noise scatter. When we're constantly reacting to emails, opinions, expectations, we confuse movement with progress. Silence invites reflection over reaction. It teaches us that emotions aren't emergencies. They're information. Research shows that self-regulation and resilience grow not when we suppress feelings, but when we sit with them. And silence is the container for that sitting. Now, here's the tough one. We live in a culture of urgency. We want answers fast, results faster, and validation instantly. But the most meaningful things in life, healing, confidence, purpose, don't respond to pressure. They emerge when we stop demanding them and start preparing to hold them. Silence is that preparation. It's where we cultivate patience, reflection, and readiness. It's the space between planting the seed and seeing the bloom. I've spent years studying vulnerability, and here's what I've learned. Vulnerability is not always loud. It's not always sharing the story. Sometimes, it's waiting in the discomfort of not knowing. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is be quiet, not because you don't care, but because you're listening for what matters most. Stay silent, everything will come to you naturally isn't about inaction, it's about intention. In an age of noise, silence is a skill. In a world of rushing, stillness is strength. And in the chase for answers, waiting is a form of wisdom. So today, I invite you not to retreat, but to rest in awareness. Not to escape, but to expand your capacity to hold space for your thoughts, for your truth, and for the life that's patiently unfolding in front of. Would you like a visual slide outline to match this speech for a presentation setting? When we hear the word silence, our minds often jump to images of emptiness, passivity, or a lack of engagement. In conversations, silence can feel awkward. In relationships, it can feel like disconnection. And in our own internal world, silence can sometimes feel like something is missing, like a void we're supposed to fill. But what if we've been seeing silence through the wrong lens? Silence is not absence. It's not a failure to speak or a sign that nothing is happening. Silence is presence. It is one of the most powerful states of awareness we can access. When we strip away the noise, the chatter, the distractions, what's left is not nothing. What's left is everything we've been too busy to notice. Silence gives us the space to feel. And feeling, especially in today's overstimulated world, is a radical act. In silence, we don't get to scroll past discomfort. We don't get to mask our pain with productivity. We don't get to out-talk our fear. Silence invites us into a kind of stillness that can be both confronting and healing. Because when we sit in silence, we're sitting with ourselves. No filters. No edits. No escape routes. Now, this doesn't mean silence is always comfortable. In fact, many of us avoid it precisely because it's not. We've been conditioned to believe that stillness means stagnation, or that if we're not constantly moving, producing, or speaking, we're somehow falling behind. But that's not true growth. That's just motion. Silence is where transformation starts, not by forcing change, but by allowing awareness to unfold. In silence, we begin to notice the patterns in our thinking. We hear the stories we tell ourselves about our worth, our capabilities, our past, and our future. And in that noticing, we are given the rare chance to challenge those stories. Have you ever sat in silence long enough to hear your own inner critic speak louder than any outside voice? That's not a sign that something is wrong. That's a sign that something is ready to be seen. And here's the thing: when we're brave enough to listen without judgment, without the rush to fix or change or numb, we start building a new relationship with ourselves. A relationship rooted not in performance, but in presence. In the realm of emotional intelligence, silence is a practice of mindfulness. It trains us to pause before we react, to listen before we respond, and to feel before we explain. That pause, that moment of intentional stillness can be the difference between a reactive life and a reflective one. And it's in that reflection that we learn about ourselves, about others, about the world around us. Silence is also where empathy grows. When we sit in silence with another person, not to fill the space with advice or opinions, but to truly be there with them, we're offering a presence that speaks louder than words ever could. We're saying, you don't have to perform for me. You don't have to impress me. I see you. I hear you. I'm with you. That kind of presence is rare. And it's deeply healing. In leadership, too, silence is often misunderstood. We assume leaders need to have all the answers, always be ready to speak, always be one step ahead. But the most impactful leaders I've studied and worked with are those who know when to pause. Who aren't afraid of silence in a meeting. Who give room for thought, for tension, for ideas to surface without rushing in to control the narrative. Silence in leadership communicates trust. It says, I believe in the wisdom in this room. I don't need to dominate. I need to listen. And that applies not just in boardrooms, but in classrooms, in communities, and in families. Silence tells our kids, our students, our colleagues, I'm not here to lecture. I'm here to understand. And that understanding starts not with a speech, but with a presence rooted in curiosity, compassion, and courage. There's also a deeply spiritual dimension to silence. Across traditions and cultures, silence is seen as sacred. It's where people have gone for centuries to seek truth, connection, and peace. And even outside of religious contexts, silence connects us with something beyond ourselves. In nature, silence brings us into rhythm with the world, the rustle of trees, the breath of wind, the stillness of water. These aren't passive moments. They're deeply alive. They remind us that not everything meaningful has to be loud, or fast, or flashy. Some of the most profound insights come when we stop trying to force them, and simply allow them to arrive. So, the next time you find yourself in a moment of silence, whether it's chosen or unexpected, I invite you not to rush out of it. Stay there a little longer. Notice what arises. Notice what your body is feeling. What your heart is whispering. What your mind is looping. Don't try to change it. Just be with it. That is presence. And presence is powerful. Presence says, I don't need to control this moment. I can experience it. Presence says, I'm enough, even when I'm not speaking. Presence says, something real is happening here, even if no one else sees it yet. Silence isn't the absence of meaning. It's the birthplace of meaning. It's where you meet yourself. And often, it's where life meets you, too. Would you like this adapted into a podcast script or reflective journal format as well? In a world that thrives on urgency, noise, and motion, emotional stillness can feel like a foreign concept. We are conditioned to keep moving, keep doing, and keep performing, often without pausing to ask ourselves how we actually feel. The idea of stopping, of simply being still with our emotions, can feel unproductive or even risky. But here's what I've learned through research, experience, and deep conversations with people who have walked through both struggle and strength. Emotional stillness isn't the absence of emotion. It's the act of sitting with it long enough to understand it. And it is in that stillness that clarity begins to form. Emotional stillness is not about suppression. It's not about pretending everything is okay or pushing feelings aside to maintain some image of control. Instead, it's about making space for emotions to be what they are: messy, uncomfortable, beautiful, informative. When we allow ourselves to be still, we stop reacting impulsively and start responding intentionally. We give ourselves the gift of perspective. Most of us are used to managing our emotions by either avoiding them or expressing them quickly and outwardly. But what happens when we just sit with them? What happens when we give ourselves permission to feel sadness without rushing to fix it, or to feel anger without immediately assigning blame? That's where insight begins to take shape. Stillness invites reflection. It invites curiosity. It allows our nervous system to settle and our cognitive system to process. It's worth noting that emotional stillness is often countercultural. We live in a time where fast reactions are rewarded. Think of social media, where immediate responses are expected and hot takes are currency. In that kind of environment, stillness can be misinterpreted as apathy or indecisiveness. But in truth, stillness is strength. It's the decision to pause before speaking, to breathe before acting, and to listen before judging. That takes courage. When you're emotionally still, you begin to notice the layers of your experience. A passing feeling of frustration might reveal itself as a deeper fear of being unheard. A sense of jealousy might uncover a hidden longing or insecurity. These nuances don't come rushing to the surface when we're in motion. They only reveal themselves in stillness, when we are willing to be vulnerable enough to look inward rather than outward for answers. And this kind of inner clarity is vital. Because without it, we move through the world reacting to symptoms rather than understanding causes. We lash out, we withdraw, we numb, we distract, and often, we don't even know why. Clarity doesn't eliminate the emotion, but it gives it a name, a shape, a context. And once you understand something, you can begin to navigate it. Not avoid it, not deny it, but move through it with intention. In educational settings, emotional stillness is essential for both learners and educators. For students, the ability to pause and recognize their emotional state can significantly impact their focus, motivation, and resilience. For teachers and mentors, emotional stillness provides a foundation for modeling empathy and emotional regulation. You can't teach calm if you're never still. You can't teach awareness if you're disconnected from your own inner life. The same applies to relationships. Emotional stillness allows us to witness the people in our lives with greater compassion. When we are emotionally reactive, we are often interpreting others' actions through the lens of our own unresolved feelings. But when we cultivate stillness, we create a gap between stimulus and response, a gap in which empathy can grow. We begin to ask, what else might be true? We begin to listen more deeply and speak more mindfully. That's not just emotional intelligence, that's emotional generosity. There's also a neurological basis for this. When we experience emotional stillness, we activate areas of the brain associated with self-regulation and executive function. This doesn't mean shutting down our feelings, it means giving the brain space to understand them. In fact, stillness increases our ability to label emotions accurately, which has been shown in psychological studies to reduce their intensity. Simply naming an emotion, saying to yourself, "This is grief," or "This is anxiety," activates the prefrontal cortex and helps restore a sense of balance. But stillness doesn't always look like sitting in silence. It can come in the form of a slow walk, journaling, deep breathing, or any moment where you allow your attention to turn inward without rushing to perform. These are not extravagant practices. They are accessible, daily opportunities to tune into yourself with honesty and compassion. The challenge, of course, is that stillness often invites discomfort. When we slow down enough to feel, we sometimes uncover pain we didn't know we were carrying. But that discomfort is not a sign of failure, it's a sign of depth. It means you are getting closer to something real. And that reality, when faced with courage, will offer far more clarity than denial ever could. So much of our suffering doesn't come from the emotions themselves but from our resistance to them. We try to outrun grief, we bury anger, we sugarcoat fear, and in doing so, we prolong our confusion. Stillness doesn't make the hard feelings go away, but it does help us understand them. And once we understand them, we're far better equipped to make wise decisions, to communicate honestly, and to live authentically. Emotional stillness is not a luxury, it's a necessity. Especially in a time when burnout, anxiety, and disconnection are rising, we need practices that bring us home to ourselves. We need clarity, not just about what we're doing, but about why we're doing it. That kind of clarity doesn't come from pushing harder. It comes from listening more deeply. So, let yourself be still. Not because you have all the answers, but because you're willing to hear the questions. Not because life is easy, but because you're strong enough to face it with your eyes and your heart open. Stillness is not passive. It is active awareness. It is the quiet place where understanding begins. And it is in that understanding that true clarity lives. Would you like to turn this into a workshop script or guided reflection session format? In a culture built on speed, productivity, and achievement, we often find ourselves at odds with time. We are told to set goals, meet deadlines, and measure success through milestones that can be tracked, shared, and celebrated. We are surrounded by countdowns, timelines, and metrics that quietly suggest we are falling behind if we haven't figured it all out by a certain age, stage, or season. But here's the truth: real growth, deep healing, meaningful change, they don't run on a schedule. They don't obey our calendars. And if we are constantly chasing outcomes on a timeline, we risk missing the wisdom that lives in the process itself. Trusting the process means allowing life to unfold in its own way and in its own time. It means surrendering the illusion that we can force clarity, rush healing, or manufacture insight on demand. The process, whether it's the process of becoming, recovering, learning, grieving, or creating, asks for something countercultural: patience, presence, and faith. Faith not in a religious sense necessarily, but in the sense that you believe there is something working within you, even when you can't yet see the evidence. One of the hardest things we face as human beings is not knowing how long something will take. When we're in a season of confusion or pain, when we're working toward a dream that's slow to materialize, or when we're just trying to feel like ourselves again after a loss or a disappointment, the uncertainty can feel unbearable. We want to know when it will be over. We want proof that our efforts are paying off. And yet, the most profound transformations in life tend to happen gradually, quietly, often beneath the surface. That's because real change is not always visible right away. Think of a seed in the soil. For weeks, maybe months, it looks like nothing is happening. But beneath the surface, the roots are growing, anchoring, preparing the seed to emerge with strength. If we judged the seed only by what we saw above ground, we might assume it had failed. But that would be missing the whole story. The same is true for us. Sometimes the most important growth is the kind no one else can see. Trusting the process invites us to let go of comparison. When we measure our timeline against someone else's, we disconnect from our own rhythm. We begin to doubt ourselves, question our path, and forget that every journey is deeply personal. It's tempting to look around and think, they're further ahead, or why haven't I gotten there yet? But those thoughts are based on a false assumption that there's only one right timeline, and that faster is better. In reality, your timeline is yours for a reason. The lessons you're learning, the detours you're taking, the pace you're moving, they're shaping you in ways that can't be rushed. We also forget that the process itself is where we build the skills, the strength, and the resilience we'll need when we arrive at whatever we're hoping for. You can't shortcut emotional maturity. You can't fast-track self-awareness. These things are forged through experience, often through discomfort, repetition, and reflection. When we focus only on the destination, we risk skipping the internal work that would have made the arrival meaningful. The process is not just a path to the outcome. It is the outcome in progress. This becomes especially clear in education and personal development. Learning, in its truest sense, is not linear. It's not about mastering content quickly or moving through lessons without struggle. It's about grappling with ideas, making mistakes, being humbled by what we don't know, and slowly integrating new understanding. When we give ourselves or others permission to learn at their own pace, we honor the integrity of the process. We say, it's okay to take the time you need. Growth doesn't have to be rushed to be real. In relationships, too, the process matters more than the timeline. Whether we're building trust, repairing a rift, or learning to love again after heartbreak, we have to release the pressure of getting there quickly. Emotions are not mechanical. They don't respond well to deadlines. What they do respond to is consistency, vulnerability, and time. When we allow relationships to evolve naturally without forcing outcomes, we create space for authenticity and connection to thrive. Even in creative work, timelines can sometimes stifle the very spark that fuels imagination. Inspiration doesn't clock in on demand. Ideas need time to marinate. Vision needs space to evolve. Rushing the creative process often leads to shallow results, not because we are not talented, but because we didn't let the idea breathe. Some of the most impactful work is born from periods of stillness, frustration, even boredom. That, too, is part of the process. But trusting the process doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing the right things with the understanding that results may not be immediate. It means showing up, day after day, even when progress feels invisible. It means planting seeds and watering them, knowing that growth is happening whether or not we can measure it yet. It means giving ourselves grace in the waiting. We need to stop treating the timeline as the only measure of success. Milestones are important, yes. But they don't define worth. They don't account for the richness of the journey, the quiet victories, the subtle shifts. When we look back at the most meaningful seasons of our lives, they're often not the ones where everything went as planned. They're the ones where we changed, where we deepened, where we became more of who we are, often through the most uncertain and unplanned moments. So if you're in a season where it feels like nothing is happening, like you're behind or lost or stuck, remember this: the process is working, even if it's working underground. There is wisdom being built in the waiting. There is courage being born in the silence. There is strength growing in the small, unseen acts of persistence. You are not late. You are not failing. You are becoming. Trust the process, not the timeline. The process is where life happens. The process is where you meet yourself. And in time, your time, what's meant for you will arrive, not because you chased it down, but because you were ready to receive it. Would you like this adapted into a meditation, workbook prompt, or classroom lesson format? When we talk about vulnerability, we often imagine it as something active and visible the moment someone speaks up, admits fear, asks for help, or shares a tender truth. We associate vulnerability with action, the risk of putting ourselves out there, the courage to be seen. And while all of that is true, it's not the whole picture. Vulnerability doesn't always look like a grand confession or a powerful speech. Sometimes, vulnerability isn't about speaking at all. Sometimes, it's about listening, truly listening when everything inside us wants to run, fix, or protect. Listening is a profoundly vulnerable act. It requires us to set aside our own defenses, our own narratives, and our own urgent need to respond. It invites us to be present with someone else's pain, uncertainty, or joy without trying to shape it into something that feels safer or more familiar. To listen without judgment, without rehearsing our next words, and without trying to manage the outcome that's a risk. That's vulnerability in action. When we listen vulnerably, we open ourselves up to being changed by what we hear. We let go of the illusion of control. We stop trying to steer the conversation toward what's comfortable or predictable. Instead, we lean into the unknown space of someone else's experience. That can feel incredibly raw because it asks us to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. It asks us to be humble enough to learn and brave enough to hold space for complexity. True listening also makes us confront our own discomfort. Sometimes what someone shares stirs up things in us we haven't yet faced: old fears, hidden biases, unresolved grief. It would be easier to shut down, to give advice, or to move the conversation to safer ground. But vulnerable listening means staying present even when it's hard. It means allowing the conversation to unfold without trying to script it or tie it up neatly. It means saying, not always with words but with presence, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. In educational settings, vulnerable listening is a critical tool for creating environments where real learning can happen. Students, colleagues, and communities thrive when they feel seen and heard. But being seen and heard doesn't just happen when we encourage people to speak, it happens when we are prepared to truly listen. It happens when we resist the temptation to jump in with solutions or corrections and instead offer our attention as a gift. Vulnerable listening in education means asking not only, what did you learn, but also, how do you feel about what you learned? It means creating space for questions without rushing to answers. In relationships, vulnerable listening deepens trust. It signals to the other person that they don't have to perform or polish their emotions to be worthy of our presence. They can be messy, uncertain, or contradictory, and we won't turn away. We don't have to agree with everything we hear to listen vulnerably. We don't have to fix what's broken or heal what's hurting. We just have to be willing to hold the moment open, to stay with the tension, and to believe that bearing witness can be enough. And this is crucial: listening vulnerably doesn't mean losing yourself or your boundaries. It's not about absorbing someone else's emotions or taking responsibility for their journey. It's about standing firm in your own groundedness while offering the space for another to be fully themselves. Vulnerability is not about merging or rescuing. It's about connection without control. There's also an internal dimension to vulnerable listening: listening to ourselves. How often do we quiet our own inner voices because they're inconvenient or uncomfortable? How often do we rush past our own fears, grief, and longings because they don't fit into the timeline or story we think we're supposed to live? Vulnerable self-listening asks us to slow down and pay attention. To notice the stirrings beneath our busyness. To acknowledge the truths we'd rather ignore. It's about allowing ourselves to sit with our own uncertainty and trust that we don't have to figure it all out right now. That simply listening openly, kindly, without judgment is an act of courage all its own. The world teaches us that vulnerability is about exposure, about revealing something raw. And sometimes it is. But other times, vulnerability is about restraint. It's about choosing not to fill the silence with noise, not to jump into action just to soothe our own discomfort. Vulnerable listening honors the space between people. It trusts that what's happening in that space, even if it's silent, even if it's awkward, even if it's painful, has value. When we listen vulnerably, we're practicing empathy in its purest form. We're saying, I'm willing to meet you where you are, without needing you to be somewhere else. We're practicing humility, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and that someone else's perspective might stretch our own understanding. We're practicing patience, allowing meaning and connection to unfold in their own time rather than forcing them into immediate clarity. It's not easy. It's often easier to speak than to listen, easier to advise than to witness, easier to react than to receive. But listening vulnerably transforms relationships. It deepens trust, fosters resilience, and creates a kind of safety that words alone cannot provide. So the next time you find yourself in a conversation where emotions are high or truths are hard to hear, resist the urge to jump in with solutions. Instead, lean into the discomfort. Listen, not to fix or change, but to understand. Listen with your whole heart, your whole presence. Trust that listening, in its quiet and courageous way, is one of the most powerful forms of vulnerability we have. Vulnerability doesn't always speak. Sometimes it listens. And in that listening, it holds, it heals, and it connects in ways that speaking alone never could. Would you also like a version of this made into a short reflective guide for workshops or emotional intelligence trainings? Thank you, my friends, for supporting my channel. I appreciate each and every one of you. Thanks for watching.